All right. Hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us. It looks like we might still have a few people coming in the room. So we will give them a minute. As you see on the screen, we have our information of who is presenting with you today, and we'll introduce ourselves. But welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from the world. But you're here for a presentation titled Risk on All Sides, Safety Planning and Jurisdiction for Military Connected Survivors. So as you're joining, if you would like to in the chat, drop where you're from, where you're joining us, make sure that you can hear us. You can also turn on the closed captions that was mentioned. You can also state your role in the chat. We'd like to know who we're talking to, and I'll go ahead and pull up the slides. All right. Again, you're here for the Risk on All Sides, Safety Planning and Jurisdiction for Military Connected Survivors. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Natalie if you want to talk about your project.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to be here and chatting with y'all today relative to this conversation with stalking. I work for the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And one of the things I really hope that you take away from this training, one of many things, is we are federally funded to offer technical assistance, training, and resources to individuals who are working in what I would consider to be first responder roles, law enforcement, prosecutors, victim advocates, to really help support and empower them in their response to stalking. So I hope that you take that away with you, and maybe it serves as an extra little tool in your tool belt as you do the very important work that you do.
And I am Kimberly Henry, and I'll talk about myself in a moment, but I'm also excited to be here. And I'm with the Advocating for Military Connected Survivors Project. I'm with NOVA, the National Organization for Victim Advocacy. That is a project funded by the Office on Violence Against Women and through the Department of Justice, and we're happy to be here.
All right, I'll jump in and introduce myself since I'm at the top of the screen here. As I mentioned, my name's Natalie. I'm a former prosecutor. I prosecuted domestic and sexual violence crimes in a small town, small communities in Tennessee for a period of time, hence the twang. But I also worked in victim service agencies with victims of domestic and sexual violence, a little bit more extensively with victims of human trafficking. And my work with Spark is with a specialized focus with the criminal legal system, so helping equip that criminal legal system to recognize and to respond to stalking. I do want to put a disclaimer. Kim has already been exposed to the sound of my voice. I am battling a cold, and I apologize for that. I'm going to try to make it through. But if you see me spontaneously go on mute and Kim has to take over, you will know what has happened. So hopefully we'll cross our fingers the next hour and a half that we'll be able to make it through and your ears won't hurt too badly.
Thank you, Natalie, for being with us. We have presented once before on this topic, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I am excited that she's here and that we're able to present to you today. I'm Kim Henry. I'm a licensed master social worker at NOVA. I have the role of the Military Coordinated Community Response, or CCR, program manager. Again, I work on the Advocating for Military Connected Survivors project, among a few other projects here at NOVA. I am a U.S. Navy veteran where I served 10 years in the Navy. I was a cryptologic technician, but I was also a sexual assault victim advocate. And it was my lived experience, along with my experience as a victim advocate, that led me to social work on a macro policy and program scale. That led me to be a civilian victim advocate, and ultimately lead me to NOVA here, where I can support community advocates and their knowledge and their capacity to ensure that military survivors everywhere have plenty of options to go to for support. So happy to be here. And I want to share a couple notes before we jump into the objectives. You will have access to the slides. We have recordings, both in English and Spanish. We are going to share the slides with you at the end of the presentation, but we will also have the slides uploaded to both our websites as well as in an email. When you log into Zoom, even if you jump out of Zoom and jump back on because of a connection issue, we are able to get your email from that, and we will send you certificates of completion. And with that, in that email with your certificate of completion, it also has the link to the recordings and the link to the slides to be able to download them, as well as how to participate in our third training that will be on this topic. That will be a slightly different, but still on stalking of military connected survivors. So you will get a certificate, you will get the slides, and you will get the recording. That we'll probably repeat that a few times and throughout this training, but it will all be emailed to you, and you do not need to send us your emails in the chat. we will get your emails from the Zoom platform. So we'll go ahead and get started. The objectives today are to identify risk factors that are associated with stalking and to understand challenges navigating military protective orders and civilian protective orders, not just for survivors, but also for you as advocates. If you, of course, working with as survivors, and if you have lived experience yourself, whether you've been active duty, you're a DoD civilian, you're a community advocate, no matter what your role is or what your experience has been, it is extremely challenging. And we recognize that, especially in the world of stalking. Natalie and I have had many conversations about stalking and military connected survivors and how it's not talked about a lot. And so there's two different systems. And then when you're trying to combine them, it's even more difficult. And we'll talk about a lot today. And we want to be here to support you, again, as community advocates. So we're going to develop stalking safety planning strategies so you can best support, again, these military connected survivors of stalking. So if you missed the first training, you can watch the recording. Again, you're going to have access to these slides so you can see the English recording and the Spanish recording. I put these QR codes in here, not to expect you to scan them right now and watch the recording right now, but so when you get the slides, you'll have access to view them. I will leave this on the screen for a moment. This is our military connected survivors of stalking toolkit between Spark and Nova on this project for advocating for military connected survivors. We developed really the first ever toolkit for advocates to support military connected survivors of stalking. It is pretty comprehensive. It has a lot of information, but it is really important to be able to provide you the tools and answer a lot of questions that we see, a lot of confusion and a lot of need for, again, strategies and direction. So you can download this toolkit. Again, there's a link, and I will also, if I can't right now, I will put the link in the chat for you. There you go. I'll put that link in that chat. Just dropped it in there for you. All right, we're also going to do just probably two polls, and then we'll have some conversation in the chat later. We like to keep the chat open to share perspective, but please make sure the chat is very directed towards the conversation and be mindful of that. But we do have a first poll here today, and I would like to know, have you ever worked on a case that involves a military protective order? See some people answering yes, and yes, please answer in the chat, or you can answer on the poll. I can see a mixed answer in the chat. Okay, it looks like some of you are actually working on some MPO with standard practice of, yeah, definitely working on a large installation. It's okay. Oh, if it's okay if you're late, it happens. Okay, let's see. All right. And so it looks like a lot of you, the majority, I would say 50, 50, 50. 50 of you have not, and some of you have at least once, and some of you have more than once. And so I'll go ahead and share those results. Everybody can see them. So that's good to know, half and half. It's really important to consider when we're talking about military protective orders, which is not necessarily what the whole training is about. But when it comes to stalking, and Natalie's going to talk about this, but when it comes to stalking, it can be very challenging because there's not a lot of visual, physical harm necessarily. And a lot of times any protective orders, but especially military protective orders in the cross jurisdiction that has to happen, can be really challenging for survivors and advocates to navigate. So I've said military connected survivors a few times. If some of you joined our previous training, thank you. We defined this. If you've ever come to one of our other trainings, we've defined this. If you're new to one of our trainings, welcome. But I want to make sure we always define this in any of our trainings. Why? Because when we say military and survivor in the same breath, a lot of times that can be misconstrued for what we commonly recognize as survivor. And military is maybe someone who survived combat, or someone who is a living survivor of someone who has died in combat. And we recognize and appreciate that service. However, in the regards of military connected survivor in our work, We recognize them as any of the individuals below who have experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, or DVSAS. And of any of these individuals that are listed on the screen, someone who is active duty, National Guard and Reserve, veterans, a civilian dependent, that could be an adult or a child, and then also an intimate partner. And this is key because if any of you have ever worked with active duty, or if you've been a DoD civilian, or really engaged with the military connected survivor, then you know a lot of the programs and services that can be offered to military connected individuals that you see on the left hand side of your screen are only offered to the left hand side of your screen, whether it's stalking, domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and intimate partners. So, someone who has shared a child or a home with us, someone on the left hand side of your screen may not actually have access to these services. So, when you think of stalking, where do they turn for help? They may not have anywhere to go. And that can be even more challenging, especially depending on where they're at. If it's a rural area, if it's somewhere with a large installation. So, as we go through these slides, I really want you to consider we're not just necessarily talking about active duty. We're not talking just, about spouses, which those individuals are extremely important, but we're also talking about intimate partners, which again is someone who can share a child or a home or someone who's been in a social relationship. So just keep that in mind as we go through these slides.
Yeah, and when we talk about stalking, talking about stalking behaviors, we do want to have a recap here about what all is included in stalking behaviors. If you joined us at our last webinar, you might remember this kind of SLI framework that we rely on quite a bit, SLII. So these are our 4 categories of behaviors. They're not mutually exclusive. This certainly is not an exhaustive list. I think one of the things that helps me as I'm trying to wrap my head around all of the ways that these behaviors can show up is understanding that kind of the intent behind each of these categories. So with surveillance, we're talking about an individual who's gathering information about a victim for the purpose of causing future harm. And that's really the important part of that category there, right? They're learning about the victim, not because they're curious about the victim, not because, they're interested, just genuinely interested in the day-to-day. They're learning about the victim and they're gathering that information for future harm. And then the second category, this life invasion, is essentially where they make themselves a part of the victim's life. They are really starting to exert that power and control over the victim. The kind of underlying message here is, I'm going to be part of your life, whether you want me to be or not. You're going to have to deal with me. You're going to have to face me. You're going to have to think about me. And so that can play out a number of ways. We're going to dig into some of the presentations of these behaviors in a bit and why the surface presentation makes it difficult to detect and really difficult to detect that risk. The intimidation stage is where this message starts to escalate and it's, starts to be less of, or maybe less focus on, I'm going to be part of your life, and more of, you should fear my presence in your life. I can cause you harm. So you should be nervous. You should be scared. You should be distressed. You should be stressed when you see my presence, when you think of me. And so they communicate that a number of ways, sometimes overt threats, sometimes it's subtle threats, sometimes symbolic violence. And then our last category, interference through sabotage or attack, is a very long way of saying harm, right? We're in the intimidation stage, we're threatening to cause harm. The last stage is stalkers actually cause harm. So, when we have that interference stage and harm is occurring, it's a little bit easier for us as outsiders to recognize, wait, something bad might be happening in this situation. What we really want to think about when we talk about these risk factors is feeling equipped to recognize stalking, recognize risk before we even get to the harm stage, right? That would be the ideal response so that we can prevent harm from happening ideally. So Kim's kind of put in here, and Kim, if you want to chat about any of these presentations of these behaviors within a military environment, but how this might play out within that military environment or on a base, these might show up in unique ways.
Yeah, definitely. When you think about the military environment, we have that mission first mindset. We're a team, we protect each other, right? We have to know where everybody's at all times. And we're part of a group chat because we have accountability and you're expected to be somewhere at a certain time. And I have to know where you're at. I have to make sure that we know what's going on. You have to check in, and there's a chain of command, and you're expected to share certain information. You're not really expected to have a certain level of privacy. And so you're put into an environment where all of these different level or all of these different factors are already ingrained, that it's minimized how much privacy or how it's not necessarily considered invasion. I'm sure many of you have heard of intrusive leadership. And in the military, it's minimized where it's not intrusive leadership. We just need to know what's going on. And we just have to keep track of everyone. We just need to know because of this, right? And to some degree, we have a mission to succeed in, right? Or we have to know, we have to have accountability. And so you could see how surveillance or what could be seen as life invasion or interference or intimidation can really, in some ways, be what stalking behavior would actually, someone could say is justified, which it's not justified, but the military environment or military standards or what needs to be done in the military work environment could actually, in their mind, be justified. And so we'll talk about that as we continue on.
Yeah, I'm hearing it makes it even more difficult to detect, right? When we have this like overlap of social norms and maybe, accepted behavior. All right, I think we've got another little poll coming up. So we're curious about your confidence. How confident do you feel? Not just even about identifying stalking behaviors, but really identifying those high risk cases. What stands out to you as cases that need a high level of response, an intensive response, high level of support? Great. We have a full spectrum here of maybe confidence and competency relative to this topic, which is fantastic. Yeah, and I'm seeing in the chat some differentiation between maybe the ability to do so in the civilian world versus military world, which is particularly relevant for this training today. That's fantastic. A great point. All right. So I think we can end that out and share those results. Y'all can take a look and see how this is playing out among the folks on the call here today. So again, we have the chance to potentially learn from each other about the work that we're doing and how we're doing this work. But, making sure that we learn and we have the opportunity to feel fluent, feel comfortable, feel confident to recognize those really high risk indicators. Ooh, sorry, got a little click happy there. Okay. So one thing that we always want to address when we talk about stalking behaviors, when I was going through those categories of behaviors, you may have even picked up on the way I was describing some of these behaviors, collecting information about an individual for the purpose of causing future harm, showing up in an individual's life. I'm going to be part of your life, whether you want me to be or not. On the surface, those behaviors can look innocuous. It's not illegal to drive down the road. It's not illegal to send text messages. It's not illegal to send a dozen roses. And so it becomes really difficult for us, royal us, I'm using here, when we talk about responders in recognizing that harm is occurring, that a crime is occurring, and that these could potentially be indicators of really a high risk situation. Really identifying stalking and even further identifying the risk factors behind stalking takes a lot of effort and energy and knowledge. Frankly, it's not anything anyone is born with intuitively. You really have to understand this dynamic and to be looking for it actively. Now, one thing that we always want to point out when we are talking about assessing risk, we are always grounding our assessment in the victim's perception. And here's what I mean by that. We might be in a situation where we are talking to a victim and we are very concerned about their safety, right? Now, if this victim has been managing, particularly if they've been managing trauma for a very extended period of time, their brain, understandably so, maybe has started to normalize some of that trauma, right? So we might be talking to them being concerned, and we might hear from them, I'm not that worried, right? And that's okay. That's a valid response, but it's a really good opportunity for us to educate. Okay, here's why I'm worried, right? Here are the things that are standing out to me, and here are the things that are making me a little nervous. The inverse of that, we are never ever in a position, there is no tool, there is no research, there is no resource available that would counter a victim's perception of risk or harm. And that if a victim is telling you, I think this person might hurt me, I think this person might kill me, we are always leading with that gut instinct, right? We're never in a position where we can tell a victim and say, you scored low risk on this tool, so it must not be that serious. We're always grounding our response. We're listening intuitively to what that victim's telling us, and we're grounding our response in their perception of the experience. So when we talk about assessments, we certainly see that, our systems as a whole oftentimes are incorporating or already utilizing a lot of domestic violence assessments, rightfully so, right? We understand, again, as a system that domestic violence, it can be an indicator of lethality, that these are high-risk cases. And so we might be utilizing in the field, we might have law enforcement officers who are utilizing domestic violence lethality assessments. We might have advocates conducting domestic violence lethality assessments. Those are fantastic, and those can be really helpful. We want to think about any of the assessments we're currently doing, if we are incorporating any kind of domestic violence assessments, and maybe just taking a critical look at those assessments to see if it is identifying stalking behaviors within the questions. Is it asking about things like jealous behavior, controlling behavior, that stalker's mentality, mindset? And we're going to dig into what that looks like from research level relative to stalking specifically, but my point here is we can use what we're already, what's already out there to really make us aware and turn us on to the idea that we might have some stalking risk factors present in those situations. And for the same reason that we do lethality assessments and risk assessments relative to domestic violence, we see a similar correlation between lethal outcomes and or really dangerous outcomes, harmful outcomes, when we identify stalking behaviors. So there is value, there is importance, again, in the same way that we've recognized, hey, if we're intersecting a victim of domestic violence, we probably want to check in and assess risk. There is value in doing so in our stalking cases as well, because we know that stalking behaviors are really closely correlated with these types of outcomes, physical assault, sexual assault. We also see an increase in the likelihood of harm to third parties. We see an increase in the likelihood that the individual is going to reoffend. It is something that really becomes a public safety issue, certainly a safety issue for the victim in the case as well. So it's something we definitely want to be paying attention to as we are engaging victims of stalking. So when we talk about risk factors, these are the risk factors that we are identifying and recognizing through the research that has been done in this field. We're going to dig into some of these, kind of a practical application of some of these. Really, what we want you to do is to be aware of what is an indicator of risk, and also be intentional about how we're asking about these indicators, right? If we do a clinical checklist assessment, we are not going to get high quality answers. Just in general, clinical assessments don't tend to generate really relational conversation. And as we walk into this, we're going to see these things that we're asking about can be really hard to talk about. It can be really sometimes hard to parse out. It can be hard for a victim to share, frankly. So we want to be honest about that. And we want to have a game plan coming in as we are working with victims of stalking, with an awareness of ways that we can structure the conversation, that we can structure our meetings, our questions, so that we are adequately identifying these risk factors, but we are still fostering a very trauma-informed conversation with these victims. So to that end, and typically, particularly if we're doing trainings in person, this is a really great time for a conversation. So put a little pin in these next two slides or next couple slides as we talk about, your own methods and your own ways of maybe working with victims and maybe providing advocacy. Because the reason I love having discussion about this, particularly if you have been in the field for long, is everybody has their own approach to starting these conversations, to fostering trust, to building relationships with victims of crime. So I want you to be thinking about that. What is your way of engaging? What is your way of approaching? And, also maybe taking the opportunity to learn from others too. So when we talk about these big picture, indicators, these questions at the top are, yes, the things that we want to know. We want to know things like, when did the behavior start? What's the nature of the behavior? Is it escalating? All of these things. Again, if we are asking that on the nose, we might really shut the person down in the conversation, right? It might not be an incredibly productive conversation. So, Kim, I want to kick it to you because I know you've had some experience both in the civilian world and the military world serving as an advocate. But, when we talk about this big picture, tell me what's going on. This can be an overwhelming place to start in working with victims of crime, particularly victims of stalking, because oftentimes their experience is long and it's complicated and it's hard to explain. And so I'm curious to know how you get that conversation started. I love hearing, from advocates. Sometimes I've heard things like, I start the conversation by asking the individual, what do you want me to know today? What's the most important thing for me to hear today? There's just little tips and tricks that I'm always learning from folks who are in the field and who have done this work that really help a victim feel heard and trusted and feel like they can share the information that's important for us to gather. So, Kim, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I was looking in the chat and some people were sharing too what they, how they communicate and how they engage with the individuals. And for me, honestly, especially not knowing why someone is coming to you and what they're about to share with you or what they're even comfortable sharing with you, I honestly just start with an open conversation about what their interests are or why they're connecting with, like, how they found me or why they're connected with me. Honestly, having a service dog would always be a topic of conversation. I was
That would
able
work for me.
to
Yes.
it was a tool, honestly, for people to be able to come talk to me and ask questions about having a service dog. And by being able to share and be open about not necessarily my own personal experiences, but be able to share that it's okay to not be okay. And being that there's a visual indication that there is assistance or an accommodation that I need, I think really helped people be comfortable with
Mm,
coming to me. And
yeah.
also just my communication. And, I had just things around my desk that people would notice, or just a sticker on my water bottle, that says love is love. And so when I had people come up to me or people would engage with me, I just say, like, what made you reach out to me? And I
Mhm.
would open that up and they would tell me, I noticed your sticker. Or when you introduced yourself, you said you were from a small town. And I would give them just tiny little tidbits. You have a service dog, or you said when I used to be a single parent, you're a single parent. And just very tiny tidbits, something that they could possibly relate to. Because I think that's honestly having a piece of that connection is what a lot of people are looking for. Because in the military, again, we have almost, I think last time I looked, we have about 500, yeah, exactly 500 people in here. And building that little piece of connection when you're in the military, it's a big world, but it's also a small world. And you might have a unit of 20 people, you might have a unit of 2,000 people, and you're constantly traveling, you're constantly, rotating, you're rebuilding support systems, you're trying to fit in, you're, you may be going through some sort of disconnect in a relationship. You're trying to be successful in your career while also trying to, still have your own identity. And so there's a constant connection or disconnect. And so for me, it was always, how can I find a way to connect with someone without even knowing who they are? And when it comes to things, domestic violence, sexual assault, and especially stalking, you're looking for a way, how can they connect with me? And so that was always my way of, what's something that can help them feel comfortable with me and connecting with me. And that would really just open up the conversation. And then we'd go from there.
Yeah, and I think it's so much about too, to your point of like, it's a tough position to be in to try to immediately foster trust because we know trust inevitably takes time, right? To have to fast track that fostering of trust can be really difficult. So I think it's so important to highlight that as we go through these questions. Yes, this is the content we want to know. We want to learn about this because this informs our assessment of the risk that this individual is facing. But we can structure the conversation in a way that really fosters trust and helps the victim feel comfortable sharing their experience. So that was kind of our first category, this big picture, right? Tell me about the relationship. How did you meet? How long have it, how do you know each other? How long has this been going on? Kind of our second category of questions are relative to the stalker's history. So this is interesting. There, you can see the data points there, the bullet points at the top. That's based on the research. These are the indicators. If these are present in the stalker's history, these are indicators of risk. This gets a little bit tricky within our military environment, right? Because there are some things here, not all, obviously, but there's some things here that maybe are more common than they are in the civilian world. In particular, experience with weapons, with firearms, experience potentially with, martial arts, fighting techniques, surveillance techniques, those types of things we might just be hearing yes to more often. So just a couple notes, and I'm going to let Kim talk about how that plays out. When she and I were discussing this and we were talking about, the prevalence maybe of some of these indicators, it made me think of being from Tennessee. There was a period of time where we understood the significance of an offender owning a firearm, but sometimes the significance of that got watered down because everyone owned a firearm. So it wasn't something that stood out to us as unique or different. And so we sometimes would lose our emphasis or our focus on collecting that as an actual risk factor. And just because that behavior is technically prevalent, it still needs to be considered as a risk factor, something that we still are talking about and we are still recognizing as a potential contributor to the risk that victim is facing. So we want to think about the ways that we can ask about, the stalker's history, their experience, their professional experience, their relational experience, and sometimes we want to think kind of outside the box. One time I heard an advocate talk about one of the ways that she collected information about a stalker's history was asking about prior relationships, right? And if you hear a victim say, oh yeah, every one of their exes, every one of their relationships were terrible, right? They all exploded. All of them were really bad. They don't talk to their family anymore. Those can be little breadcrumbs that we might be following to really identify those risk factors. So Kim, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the application of some of the stalker history, or maybe what might be a little bit unique with the stalker's history if they are in the military?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a common term or common phrase that I hear and I have heard regarding military personnel or just the military environment is you joined, what did you expect? And I think that's it's kind of a silly question because I don't think anybody knows what to expect. Even if you have generations in the military, everyone's experience is different. And so when you think about stalker history, especially in the military environment, you also have to consider not all offenders of stalking are in the military, right? You have civilians as well who are committing stalking against people who are in the military. And so there's that unique dynamic as well. But when we're looking at the military environments and you see these military specific questions, when you're assessing for that risk, you're looking at not only have they received training in weapons and tactics or surveillance techniques, but that is almost expected. And not just the general training that you get at boot camp, but do they have actually advanced training in that weapons training or that surveillance skills? And how accessible do they have to those tools or those weapons? Or, as I said, I was in cryptologic technology and different forms of intelligence. And so there are certain things that I know how to do. There are other people who have even more access to certain types of technology. What are they using those for? What other forms of technology or means do they have certain forms of technology or technology abuse? You also have to think of things like group chats. Again, the military is huge on accountability. And many times they use things like group chats. And so in the military environment, if you have someone who's experiencing stalking and the victim has to continue to report in a group chat or go to a unit formation and that person is experiencing stalking and that with the offender who's in their unit or uses that group chat to monitor them, that can be an extreme challenge to try to show, hey, I don't want to be in this group chat. I don't want to be near this person. I don't want to come to this formation. But again, as Natalie said, stalking causes harm, but it can be very difficult for people who don't see a physical harm for them to feel like there's a reality of harm there. And so it could be difficult for that victim to get out of formation because, again, you're in the military. You're supposed to go to formation. What did you expect? Also, think about the military ID. And I talked a little bit about this in the last training, but how many bases do you go to, which should be almost every base? It may not happen every day, but how many times Do ID cards, military ID cards get scanned when you go through the gate, right? There are certain people who have access to those systems. And so you may not know it, but consider the person who does have access to see when those ID cards are being scanned. You may not realize that someone is looking at when it's being scanned, but someone's schedule could actually be developed off of when they're coming to base, maybe when they're leaving base, how many times they come to base. Do they go to lunch every day and come back? They can basically look at the gate security and figure out someone's schedule. There's also thinking about have they used service related social media or group chats. Again, the military is all over the world. So the military does depend on social media. They do depend on other forms of communication. And so looking at the stalker history, how have they used that? I've seen where there have been command or unit Facebook pages or social media pages. And because everyone is expected to be in that military page that's a part of that unit or that command, if someone removes themselves, then they're the one. Why are they removing themselves if they don't want to be part of that unit? Maybe they're removing themselves because someone else is abusing access to that because they're, having stalking behaviors of the person that removed themselves. But the problem person isn't seen as the one who is having the stalking behaviors. The problem person is the one that removed themselves. Because again, in the military environment, we have this idea of camaraderie and, mission first and unit first. So it creates more challenges for the victim. And the last one, has there ever been an informal or formal complaint made against them during their military service? This is a really important question because you have to look at not just the history of their necessarily their stalking behaviors, but their military history in general. How long possibly did they serve in the military? So many of you being advocates, again, whether you've been a civilian advocate your entire career or you've been a DoD advocate as a civilian or active duty, National Guard or Reserve, you've probably experienced someone who has been discharged other than honorable or dishonorable discharge or an admin discharge. You maybe have worked with someone through the entire legal process, working with a victim, and they were able to see their offender get a discharge like that, and not just through a DVSAS case. But we know that people are discharged for committing a crime. And so it's important to ask when you're assessing for risk, just the same way that Natalie was bringing up, why does their family not talk to them? Why are all their relationships bad? Also ask those questions about military service. Like, how long did they actually serve in the military? What installations were they at? How long were they at those installations? I had a case specifically where once I, just started asking a little bit about the history, we realized that that person, the offender, was actually not in the military at all. They were pretending to be in the military so they could get access to certain information and actually also certain social media pages so they can stalk the person who was in the military. So once I started asking questions and the victim truly believed that this person was in the military and didn't understand why they could not get help and get this person to stop and get this person's command to get this stalker to stop these behaviors, that's because this person didn't have a command because they weren't in the military. But they were able to access these different, again, social media accounts and different platforms and, communicate with friends through different units because they were friends with people in the military, but they actually weren't in the military. But they were using those methods, essentially, those routes to be able to stalk this person who was in the active duty service member. So it's interesting to consider like we said on the last slide, the bigger picture of the stalker history. And so I also wanted to go to the chat, and so I see we had a few questions come in. It says, how common, I'm going to scroll up to the top. How common is it for a military person to report another military person for stalking? Is there data? That is a great question. And something Natalie and I we love that question. There is not a lot of data. There's not a lot of reports and there's not a lot of data. We would love for there to be more research on this. We do have the annual reports that come out from the DoD, NOVA credentials, the Department of Defense sexual assault victim advocates. We work with the DAVAs, the domestic abuse victim advocates. We credential civilian advocates. We do a lot of work in this space. But when it comes to research and data, there's really not a lot of data on military connected survivors and stalking, where they're military civilian. And so, this is why we're talking about this, because it is a challenge to find the data, to do the research and find the information? So that's a great question. I'm going to keep going down these questions. Natalie, just jump in if you have anything as well to say. Let's see. A lot of technology and stalking, and clients are very interested in what is new and how it works. Yeah, technology is also a key role in stalking, especially now with AI, which is a whole nother training. We won't get into that necessarily. Let's see. I just want to make sure I answer all the training, all the questions.
Yeah, I saw a question in there which I was curious about. It talked about, could a civilian request military records for, for purposes of maybe like verifying some of this information that they're hearing from an offender? I don't know what that process looks like or what that possibility is. Do you know much about that, Kim?
Yeah, so there are not, so that is, we have a whole 3-hour training on the legal, for basically for, it's really for attorneys and legal personnel, that talks partially about that. No, you can't necessarily just request someone's military records. It's not super easy. There are ways to do it, but no, it's not, you can't just have like a FOIA request and just get someone's military record. Yeah, there are certain things you could request, but no, it's not like a, no. The easy answer is no.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's how you find people that are pretending to be stolen valor. It takes time to figure that out because it's a
The
challenge,
process.
and
Yeah.
yeah, that's how
Yeah.
people are
100%.
easily able to do it.
Yeah.
Do you find that most military reports of stalking, DVSA, are on other military members, or are there more military and civilian relationships? Again, it's hard to compare that when it comes to stalking because there's not a lot of data when it comes to military. But what we can say is we do know, of course, that stalking and behaviors are correlated and relevant to domestic violence and sexual assault. We know that the statistics of sexual assault and domestic violence, the 1 in 3 for women of sexual assault, 1 in 6 men for sexual assault, but there are links between them. But comparing them for stalking for this training, the data is just not there for military. I see another question, and then we'll go to the next slide. Military specific, can a military person use their privilege and protected status to stalk? Yes, and it does happen. So military using their privilege and their protected status, one, as you move through the ranks, you have access to more information, more privileged information, just like personnel information, PII, right? Personable identifiable information. So the addresses to where your people live, the phone numbers, because you have to keep, again, accountability. You have to keep track of where everyone is at. You have access to their records, so you have more control of their evaluations. You are able to make decisions on their career. You have more control and leverage over what you want them to do. You can, expect or request that there be meetings or formations, and you only tell that one person, and that one person, that victim, is the only one that shows up because they didn't know that they were the only one that was told to show up. Like, having rank and protected status can definitely be a huge contributor to stalking.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll keep going through the questions.
Yeah, that's great. And if you guys want to pop in your questions in the Q&A, that kind of helps us
Yeah.
keep track of them a little bit better as opposed to having to scroll back through. But these are some great questions and we certainly don't want to miss them. Adrian, I see yours about the difference between crush and infatuation when it becomes harmful or obsessive. I would really recommend clicking into our first training because we really break down the basics of the stalking behaviors as a whole. But when we talk about stalking, we are talking about a exertion of power and control over another person. This is not about love. It's not about infatuation. An offender might blame their abusive behavior on that, right? In the same way that someone who's engaging in domestic violence might say, oh, I'm just jealous because I love you so much. We know that's not the case. The reality of stalking behaviors, when it is stalking, is when an individual is exerting power and control over another person. So, like I said, our first training kind of digs into that with a little bit more specificity, but it's a great question and a really common one that we get. So when we talk about these risk factors, I mentioned the firearms in particular, and particularly when you are in a culture, a community where firearm ownership is common, this risk factor can really get watered down. But we want to make sure that we are still collecting this relative to the research that is out there. So when we have an individual, an abuser, an offender, someone who's engaging in stalking behaviors and they own a firearm, we want to make sure we are paying attention to that critically. That's another little red flag that we're collecting as we are assessing risk in that victim's life. So when we talk about the mindset of a stalker, oh, sorry, I got a little click happy again. The stalker's mindset, can be a little bit difficult. And really what I would encourage you to think about, what we're trying to do here is figure out where that stalker's mental justification is, right? When we hear from a stalker that they're entitled to this behavior, that they are entitled to this other person, if they are very audacious in their behavior, engaging in proxy stalking, which means like having third parties carry out their abusive behavior. When we hear them, say things like, no one's going to stop me from doing this, nobody's going to stop me from having you. Those are things we really want to be paying attention to, because those are risk factors that we should be collecting. The reason I say this category is tricky is because when we are asking the victim about the stalker's mindset, it can be easy, frankly, for sometimes those questions to sound a little victim blaming, right? Have you ever told them to stop? Why do you think they're doing this? So we want to be really careful about the way we structure these conversations, that we are still fostering trust with a victim and helping them understand their perspective. Have they communicated why they think this behavior is okay? Do you think that they know that this behavior is unwanted? We want to be really careful about the way that we frame these questions and frame this conversation. But the stalker's kind of tenacity, their persistence, their resistance to being told to stop. If a commanding officer is like, hey, cut it out. If a protective order goes into place, if law enforcement says, hey, you have to stop, and they continue their behavior, certainly a red flag we want to be paying attention to. So Kim, do you have thoughts about that relative to our military community when we talk about the stalker mindset?
Yeah, I think a big key of it is going back to the mission mindset, right? And the protectiveness. They were looking out for me. They said that it was their duty to keep me safe. That mindset of loyalty to the mission, loyalty to the units, and obeying or having that, or as it says here, obedience. You don't want to betray your unit. You don't want to betray your team. Also, it can really be used to weaponize a survivor, really weaponize guilt survivors into silence. And so a stalker may actually contact someone's command under false pretenses, as I mentioned earlier, to sabotage their career, especially if they're already in a level of leadership or privilege. And in some cases, they can actually believe that they own the survivor in some regards, especially if they're married or they have a certain level of not just rank, but a role or position. And so it's really important to ask those questions of, have they attempted to contact your chain of command or your superiors about you? Just asking these questions and thinking about, what is a stalker's mindset, and maybe considering what are they wanting to do next?
Yeah, absolutely. So our last category of questions that we want to be talking about and thinking about is the victim's circumstances. What is the victim's kind of level of vulnerability? And a couple things, or kind of maybe two ways to think about vulnerability. We can think about logistical vulnerability. And unfortunately, what we see happen a lot of times is the victim ends up increasing their logistical vulnerability in response to the stalking behaviors. I'll give an example of that. But if maybe you're experiencing stalking from a stranger and your home gets broken into and you no longer feel safe in your home, but there are no resources in your community for a victim of stranger stalking. So you start hopping from hotel to hotel, right? You're doing that in response to the stalking behaviors, but now we've increased that logistical vulnerability. So those are things we want to be thinking about. We also want to think about relational vulnerability. Did they just go through a bad breakup? Did they just move to a new town? Did they lose a job? Are they up for a new job, like a promotion at work? That relational vulnerability can tell us a lot too about the risk factors that victim might be facing. Kim, do you want to give some perspective on how that victim vulnerability might play out within the military culture?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is we go everywhere in the military, and depending on if they live on base, off base, I give a training specifically about how community advocates can help victims with housing, because it can be very challenging, especially if a community advocate can't get on base. How do you support them? And there's a lot of questions there, because that get brought up, because you have to ask, does a victim or survivor have access to that housing allowance? Do they even have access to that house? What if it's an intimate partner? Do they have access to BAH or COLA? if they share a child with that active duty service member, and who actually gets told to leave the house if there's instances of domestic violence or, sexual assault, stalking, whatever the case may be. And all these questions, you're like, how is that relevant to the victim vulnerability? Because, you add these challenges of the victim wanting to leave or them being vulnerable. In this case, again, that creates that mindset of that obedience or that ownership. And so when you're looking at the culture or the mindset of the military, there's a lot of benefits, there's a lot of allowances, there's a lot of resources in the military. And so it creates this vulnerability that military connected victims or military connected survivors don't want to make a report because they don't want to mess anything up for themselves or possibly the offender. They don't want to be isolated. They don't want to be moved. They don't want to be separated. They don't want their career to be impacted. They don't want it to cost them their clearance, or they don't want to be reassigned. They like where they're at. I've seen victims be moved to buildings that are closer to the building where their offender lives. I've seen where there have been people that are the survivors that are actually, they're the ones that are moved off installation. I've seen, kind of students that were in class and they have to stop class instead of the offender being the one to stop the class because the survivor is the one that, they're struggling. And so there's just a lot of challenges and it puts them in more vulnerability. And asking these questions, do you live in on-base housing, or what does your housing situation look like? Do you have support systems? Are you isolated? Asking these further questions, because the military environment is very unique, can help you better understand the risks that are associated. There we go.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
The old mute faux pas. I saw the question about the hotel hopping, increasing logistical vulnerability. We know in general, when you're staying in a hotel, motel, you have less control of your physical security, right? Because inevitably you are using a key card or maybe an old-fashioned key, right? Or a Bluetooth on your phone to get access to a room. We know that there are other humans, other individuals in that building who have access to your room. It gets really difficult for us to say this is a secure space and there was no way, we're really limiting the ability for other people to physically access us. There is an increase in the likelihood that there can be physical access to the victim when we are in hotels, motels, public shared spaces, not only in the room, but also, going to and from the parking lot, going to and from the, being in the lobby. You're just exposed in a much more public way that can make it very difficult to maintain your security. So one thing I really want to highlight before we jump into kind of navigating some of the legal systems relative to this risk is this really helpful tool. This lives online at coercivecontrol.org. But this is a stalking and harassment assessment and risk profile. And this is an assessment that is relative to the risk factors that have been identified through the research. So it's a really great way for not only for victims to go through and collect their thoughts and information about their own experience. They're going to be answering questions that kind of walk through those risk factors. It's a really good tool and resource for advocates or for folks who are working with victims of stalking, not only to organize that experience through that narrative report, but also to have an analysis of how that experience compares to the risk factors, so that risk profile will truly say, based on the information you put in, 13 of the 14 risk factors are present. That's a helpful indicator, right? That's a really good tool for us if we are trying to determine how much risk this individual is facing. And it also offers some safety planning suggestions, which I think is a great way to just make sure we're, checking all of our boxes, that we're offering all of those resources and thinking through all of those things. So I just want to highlight that really quickly before we move on to the legal challenges and stalking cases. And Kim, I'll let you talk about this a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges that military connected survivors face is the disconnect between different systems, really the civilian and the military systems, but specifically the legal systems. Commanders have really broad discretion over whether to investigate or really acknowledge a stalking report. Military protective orders cannot automatically just be enforced off base by civilian law enforcement. We'll talk about the differences between them on the next slide. And civilian protective orders and no contact orders must be enforced on military bases and installations by military law enforcement. But even that causes confusion because sometimes people get them flipped around, and that's not the case on how they're supposed to operate. So survivors can really hesitate to report because the confusion There are advocates at times that get confused. There are legal personnel and law enforcement that get confused. And it's just really difficult to navigate. If you have not worked with military personnel and you've only worked with civilians, if you worked with any kind of no contact order or emergency protective order and you've got confused, now imagine doubling that and having to go through two different systems. So here is a chart, and we actually have a toolkit that you can also have access to on our link tree, which is at the end of the slides as well, that helps dive further into military protective orders and civilian protective orders. But you can see there's differences, whereas military protective orders can be initiated by the survivor, the commanding officer, or a family advocacy advocate, whereas civilian protective orders can be initiated by the survivor or a parent or guardian. And I recognize in some states it's different, some jurisdictions. I live in Texas, and a law enforcement officer can initiate a protective order depending on the case and the situation, even without the survivor saying that they want one. So I recognize that civilian protective orders, depending on the state, can be different. So that's even confusing. They have to be issued by a commanding officer for the military protective order of the service member who is the subject of the order, which can also create challenges, can be very uncomfortable for the survivor as well. Civilian protective orders go through a civil court, but this is where we're going to talk about what's key with stalking is that, again, military protective orders are enforced within military installations and areas. Civilian protective orders are enforced both on and off military installations. Now, does this mean that military protective orders cannot at all be enforced off base? Not necessarily. We talk a lot in our project about being able to coordinate and work together and collaborate. And there are jurisdictions, there are areas that have memorandums of understanding and memorandums of agreement between military and civilian law enforcement that say, hey, we are made aware because the military protective orders do get put into a national database. And if you let civilian law enforcement directly know that there's a new military protective order and this person out in the community is violating it, then we can detain them until military, law enforcement can be notified or till there can be some sort of action taken. But that's up to that jurisdiction and that state and their legal, really what they have legal rights to do. But those agreements, those memorandums of understanding, that collaboration is possible and can provide more protection. And then there's, again, differences in who can enforce it and what the due process is. The due process for military protective orders is it's immediately. There are different types of civilian protective orders. There's the emergency. There is the no contact orders. There's just the general civilian protective orders. Again, with these different civilian protective orders in general, that can be confusing, let alone now you have a civilian route and you also have the military route, which can be challenging. Full faith and credit is not entitled. It's only enforceable by the commanding officer in military law enforcement. If you're not familiar with full faith and credit, essentially it says that a protective order in the civilian world is entitled to and enforceable by all courts and law enforcement in all states, tribes, and U.S. territories. So if there's a civilian protective order in one area, then it is protected in another state or another area. Whereas military protective orders, it's only enforceable by that military law enforcement. So it doesn't necessarily cross state lines because it doesn't pertain under the UCMJ. Firearm prohibitions, there are technically rights for that, or not I'll say rights, but there is accessibility for military individuals to still have access to their military firearms, which can be very dangerous, even if they have a military protective order. And we know when civilian protective orders are in place, they can still, both and military protective orders, sometimes they can still have access. And there can be consequences if there are violations. So it's really important to consider that there are protective orders, but with stalking, just like any other form of DVSAS, it does not necessarily guarantee the safety of a survivor. We do have a break, but I want to make sure that we get through the slides. So if you want, please take a moment to stretch and get a drink of water, but we're going to go ahead and continue. So we just want to review briefly when we're thinking about military connected survivors and stalking. Again, if you have questions, make sure you just add them to the Q&A. I see a few coming in and we can answer them in the chat, in the Q&A box. But when we think about shifting from the specific questions that you want to ask to assess for the risk and the harm forced military connected survivors, when you're going from the general questions of stalking and risk and specifically looking at the risk for military connected survivors, we have to think about what specifically in the military environment causes further challenges. So think about access to the control, the housing, and the command. So installation access enforcement really varies. And what we mean by that is the access to different bases. For example, I was stationed in Hawaii, and on almost every base, there are a ton of different contractors doing a ton of different jobs and from companies from everywhere. Also, a bunch of different countries. It's a joint base, right? They're both at Pearl Harbor and a couple of the other different bases. And so when you consider the access and who can get on different bases or different installations, as well as how it's enforced, and does everybody scan your ID card when you come in the gate? I would say no, not necessarily. What does that mean for someone who's experiencing stalking? What kind of relationship is being built from the person who scans the ID cards and the person who's really not probably supposed to be coming on base? And what challenges does that create for the person who's experiencing stalking? Victims can still see the perpetrator in shared spaces. I did 3 deployments. One of them was on a ship similar to the one in the picture. But if you can imagine being on a floating city with 6,000 people, it's a big ship, but there's really not a lot of places to go. So if you're experiencing stalking and you're on a floating city for 10 months, you can imagine that you're probably going to see that person and there's nowhere to get away from them. But you can also imagine in the barracks, right? On bases, military installations, you go to the post office, and I say this in every training, but you go to the post office, you buy your toilet paper, you buy your groceries, you work out, you go to class, you work, everything in one place, like on one installation. And so it's possible you're never going to get away from the person. You feel like you're never going to get away from that person that you're experiencing harm from. And also, on base housing can complicate separation, especially with the cost of off base housing. And the command does have discretionary enforcement on what they choose the enforcement is going to be, and what the limitations are. Let's see. There are also reporting and unrestricted reporting limits. Again, stalking is not necessarily, I had seen that someone put in the Q&A asking about stalking being in the SAPR training or, in the continuum of harm. Stalking isn't talked about in a lot of military trainings. And so what is done in regards to reporting and restricted and unrestricted reporting? That is extremely important because how often is stalking talked about in the military environment? And then again, our focus in this project is community advocates. What are community advocates being educated on when it comes to military connected survivors of stalking? That's why we're here. But the command does hold very significant influence, especially the culture or the fear. We know that just like in a community workplace, if leadership is making a joke about something or minimizing an experience or minimizing a show on Netflix that some of you have talked about and making fun of it or saying it would never happen. And if someone's actually experiencing something similar to that, I can guarantee you they're probably not going to reach out for help, or they know that their leadership's not going to take it serious. We also know that there's very few protections for Guard and Reserve survivors. There's a huge a lack in data for them. And also they're living in 2 worlds all the time. Sometimes they're, connected to the military and sometimes they're civilians. And there's a huge inconsistency in the services that they receive as well. And then again, we are all over the world. So there's jurisdiction gaps, there's overlaps. It's inconsistent from on base to off base. Lawyers get confused. They're constantly moving, so many challenges. And so if you're trying to get support and you're experiencing stalking, the challenges are technically this didn't happen here. Technically, the person who is stalking you they're doing it over technology and they're located in a different country. So do we have jurisdiction? But you're not really stationed here. You're just here temporarily. You're actually stationed in California, but you're on deployment in Japan and the person is in Germany. Like you can only imagine the challenges that come from someone who's a military connected survivor that's experiencing stalking. So what are some of these basic considerations when we're talking about safety planning of military connected survivors to evolve that plan. And third, consider the stalker's next move. If they're losing access, you have blocked and what the military comes in. Try to build these relationships with the military. And if you're in the DoD and you're here, we're both safety and freedom. We definitely don't want to restrict them, especially if they're in a new unit. We want to lead. Our job is really not, but again, having safety planning, it has to be where it, it, it
Uh, you know, we as an advocate with a prescriptive like safety plan, here's your safety plan. We're going to tell you, what to do, what you can and can't do. Really making sure that we are understanding it's not the victim's responsibility to live a smaller life, right? What we really want to do is help them make informed consent world and may or may not be contributing to their vulnerability. So just having that kind of victim participation, I think, is so effective.
Yeah, thank you. And for this safety planning, again, it's not one size all. Survivors navigate multiple systems: the military, the civilian, different states, different locations, different family dynamics, off base, on base, moving. It's just National Guard, Reserve. It is very challenging. So you have to keep that in mind. And it does seem overwhelming. In almost all of our trainings, we have community civilian advocates who tell us that it's intimidating to work with a military connected survivor. And we 100% understand that. And that's why we're here. A lot of the trainings that we've developed in this project, we've developed them because someone will just come ask us a question. What do we do if we're trying to help a victim who is, they live on base, but we're advocates that can't get on base because we're not military connected? Great question. Let me tell you how. And we're here to help you because it is challenging. And we recognize that. And we're here to support you because it's not a one size fits all. It is a challenge. And keep in mind that not all survivors, again, they're not all entitled to military protections like intimate partners. And so they're really left to depend on you as community advocates. And you are capable. You do have the capacity. You do have the victim advocacy, the empathy skills that you need, the crisis response skills that you need. It's just taking those additional factors and considering how the military environment and culture is unique to their experience. Also consider how stalking escalates around different transitions, as I stated earlier, the training, the separation, the consequences, so forth and so on. It's okay. Oh, we're switching. What's happening? So safety planning questions to consider. So most of you probably have a safety planning tip sheet or a worksheet, or you have trainings within your agencies. I would like you to consider adding some of these questions to your safety planning worksheets, tip sheets, or if you actually have a list of questions that you ask, and just integrating them in here, but not just asking, what have you already done? Think about the military mindset. When you ask, what have you already done? Think about what military's individuals are, what they have expected of them. Military survivors are often incredibly resourceful. They may have already changed their routines, avoided certain areas on base. They've probably changed their workout times if they're extremely physically active. They've even tried informal interventions through their chain of command. They've already tried multiple things that you may not have considered. So start here by showing the respect for their efforts in building the trust. And then ask them, what do you need my help doing? It's possible they have already tried some resources on base. It is not that the victim advocates on base are not capable. It's not that the victim advocates and the services on base are not there to help them. That's not the case at all. But they're going possibly off base because that's either where they feel most comfortable. Maybe the offender is on base and they feel harm by being on base. And maybe they think by going off base, they'll have more separation. But it's possible that they already have gone on base and they're trying to get additional resources. So asking them what they need your help doing can give them more of that autonomy and gives them more control back. Asking them the questions about not just what are your living arrangements, but specifically, do you live on base or off base, can help them feel more comfortable about your confidence in working with a military connected individual. And then ask, is the person stalking you and are they in your unit or your command? Really helps understand, do they need to really have some significant changes in their location and their units, maybe schedule, and in your role in helping them communicate that and advocate for them. Do you already have access to that military advocate or maybe another civilian advocate? Because again, that's someone that you can connect with. Ask them and let them have that control. How about we collaborate with them and how about we see what we can work together to do? Have you already reported this incident? Because you want to make sure that they're having access to all the resources. There are many resources on the base and through military programs. And so working together can ensure that survivor is getting all the options and resources and programs available to them, but also asking them, what are they not willing to do? The military is a huge system. It's huge. And so when you're a military connected survivor of any form of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, everyone has a different experience and everyone feels differently about it. But survivors often experience that they're the problem and that they're putting a bad mark on the military. And so a lot of them are not willing to make a formal report. A lot of them are not willing to report inside the military or to a military program. So ask them, what are they not willing to do?
Yeah, so let's talk about some case studies, and Kim, maybe I'll give you a chance to answer some of those questions in our Q&A because I think that they will be better answered by you and your expertise, your knowledge. So when we talk about the ways that this plays out, we just wanted to highlight a couple of actual cases where we have these stalking behaviors present and frankly get overlooked, particularly when we have stalking behaviors that the harm is not overt. So in this situation, we had essentially a breakup. And the individual, the Staff Sergeant Thomas Shipman, starts engaging in this repeated contact, this unwanted contact with the victim. So at one point, there were like 50 plus messages that were sent that were unanswered. This individual is also gaining access to the victim's like career photos, career records, their schedule, they're tracking their career performance, and they're letting the victim know that they have access to these things. Like, hey, I saw you missed work lately. Hope you're okay. So the reason we want to highlight this case in particular is because first and foremost, these text messages by the systems at large, both civilian and within the military systems, were not seen as stalking. It wasn't really even identified as threatening because it's just text, right? This is a really good example of really just assessing the behavior on the surface level. It's just a text message. How bad could it be without digging down below that surface level behavior and looking at the intent behind the behavior here, that exertion of power and control over the victim's life, and the fact that, invasive behavior does cause harm. We talked about this, I think, in our last training, but we sometimes overlook things like text messages and phone calls. But I would argue if you guys get off this training and you looked at your phone and you had 100 missed calls, right? Even if you had 15 missed calls, you might have a startled response like, oh my goodness. Nobody ever looks at 15 missed calls and says, oh my gosh, I must have won the lottery. I bet something really good has happened. They look at 15 missed calls and they think immediately something's wrong, something bad happened, right? It disrupts the day. It causes this like little micro harm in that victim's life. So, all that to be said, we want to really think about being equipped and empowered to recognize these behaviors. Even when it is not overt harm, we want to make sure that we are equipped to recognize them. So, when we talk about this case in particular, we see, that offenders' involvement in the military did not do much, unfortunately, for prevention or for de escalation of the situation. We really lacked a response, a robust response in this case, particularly. And our next case, we just wanted to highlight a couple examples of this. Unfortunately, there's a plethora of examples in our headlines. And for some reason, my clicker is not working anymore. Oh, maybe it is. Okay. Excuse me, Kim, I'll let you speak to this a little bit with more specificity. But when we see this jurisdictional complexity, and Kim's highlighted this already with some of the examples in general about how the confusion around jurisdictions, which is governing, can really create some difficulty. Kim, I'm going to kick it to you.
Yeah. So as I stated earlier, when you have military installations where there's contractors, there's civilian, like DoD civilians, there's military personnel, there's families. There are a lot of challenges. And this is a real case that happened where you had a civilian contractor that was working at a Navy hospital who had stalked a military service member. And the offender was not a service member, but they had routine access to a secure military space. And there was really a lot of jurisdictional challenges and survivor protection in these military settings that caused a lot of challenges for that survivor to get help and access. And then there was technology abuse that happened. And so, because of all of these different really disconnects, the stalking was really allowed in a way to continue. And so, working together, being able to answer some of these questions by the advocates asking these risk assessment questions and also safety planning questions could really help identify what these risks are and provide better services and better protections for that survivor. I'm going to go to the next slide because I want to make sure we cover everything. Let's see. I'm going to have you cover that one.
Yeah, I think that's just a recap of our stalking behaviors, making sure that we are equipped to recognize them in all of its forms, not just when we are hitting that point of harm, that stage of harm, that we recognize and understand all of these behaviors are part of that course of conduct and should be considered stalking and should be taken seriously.
Okay, so here's a toolkit that we were talking about. I want to see, I'll leave it up on the screen for a moment. Do you see any other questions in the chat?
I think we have some in our Q&A box that we may have time to tackle. I know that there was a question about, is stalking a determining factor to break confidentiality? Or is there a threshold in certain behaviors that we should consider before we break the survivor's confidentiality? I'm not quite sure what we mean about confidentiality, what the professional role is. I'm going to assume as an advocate. I think that kind of depends on what your agency's policy is relative to confidentiality. And I'm guessing you mean by breaking confidentiality, you mean reporting it to something. I'm not in the military world. I'll let Ken speak to that. For me, in the civilian world, you're really only dealing with a compulsion to report, an obligation to report when you have a minor, right? A child, someone under the age of 18 who's facing harm or threat of harm, or you have a vulnerable adult. Anything beyond that, there is not an obligation to report. But Kim, you may be able to speak to that with more specificity in the military world.
Yeah, let's see. I was responding to another question. So when it comes, are you talking about the first one? No, it's okay.
Talking about, is stalking a determining factor to break confidentiality? I was saying in the civilian
Depending
world,
on if it's like the imminent risk and harm. So that is a challenge. That is a challenging question again. And it comes back to, I don't want to say proving that there's a lot of doubt and questioning and how bad is it? I saw someone had mentioned at the beginning of the training that what is enough, and enough is different for everybody. And so it comes back to the boundaries, or what is people's definition of the harm, and being able to prove how far it's gone, and people being able to justify, we have to go to that training, or we have to go to formation, we have to go to accountability. What do you expect? And so it can be very challenging to be able to get to that point. Good question. And actually, I want to point out that we are going to send out a list of all the frequently asked questions from all 3 of the trainings at the end of the 3 sessions, because we have a session next month as well. So we are saving all of the questions and all of both the ones that were answered and the ones that are not answered. So I don't want you to feel like you're not going to have your questions answered. If this is our next training on October 28th, I'm going to put this slide up here for a moment, but I'm also going to copy that information in the chat as well. I cannot type and talk at the same time.
Well, while you're
All right.
typing, I'll thank you all for hanging in there with me through this late summer cold. I appreciate your patience and understanding. And we hope that you'll join us for our training that's coming up again, our third training in October. And I think, Kim, they have the opportunity, if they fill out the survey, if there are things that you specifically want to hear about or know about, they can let us know in the survey. Is that right?
Yes. So if you can take this survey, so I'll review how to get your certificate. And also I'm putting, as you all are saying, thank you in the chat. I'm going to put the link to the slides in the chat a couple times so you can see it. But this survey, it's very important to continue for us to be able to continue to do this work. We push really hard that this work needs to continue. These trainings need to continue. We are pushing being, grant funded under the Department of Justice that it's important for advocates to have this support and have this information and to develop these toolkits, develop these guides. We have more work that we want to do with Spark and work together. So if you can please take this short survey and share your thoughts. We would love to have more trainings and we plan on having more. I'm sorry that we ran a little short on time, but if you take the survey and then the slides again, the slides is what the link is in the chat. I will be sending all of you an email. Your emails are collected through Zoom, so I don't need you to send me your email in the chats. You will also get the frequently asked questions after the third session. So if you get your certificates, you will also get an email probably in November with the frequently asked questions and updates on any new trainings we're going to have regarding this topic and other topics. But you can feel free to email me or Natalie, of course. This is our information. You'll see our information as well in the certificates and as that you can email us. But we are so grateful for you being here. And I know we're over time, but I'll stay on for a couple more minutes and I'll take any other questions that you have. And I very much appreciate everything that you've done and spending your time with us today. And I will put the survey link in the chat too.